I wish if they're going to find any evidence they'd be about it. I don't like this place. Mrs. Peters. But I'm awfully glad you came with me, Mrs. Hale. It would be lonesome for me sitting here alone. Mrs. Hale. It would, wouldn't it? Dropping her sewing. But I tell you what I do wish, Mrs. Peters. I wish I had come over sometimes when she was here. Looking around the room, wish I had. Mrs. Peters. But of course you were awful busy, Mrs. Hale. Your house and your children. Mrs. Hale. I could have come. I stayed away because it weren't cheerful. And that's why I ought to have come. I've never liked this place. Maybe because it's down in a hollow and you don't see the road. I don't know what it is, but it's a lonesome place and always was. I wish I had come over to see Minnie Foster sometimes. I can see now. Shakes her head. Mrs. Peters. Well, you mustn't reproach yourself, Mrs. Hale. Somehow we just don't see how it is with other folks until something comes up. Mrs. Hale. Not having children makes less work, but it makes a quiet house. And ride out to work all day, and no company when he did come in. Did you know John Wright, Mrs. Peters? Mrs. Peters. Not to know him. I've seen him in town. They say he was a good man. Mrs. Hale. Yes. Good. He didn't drink, and kept his word as well as most, I guess, and paid his debts. But he was a hard man, Mrs. Peters, just to pass the time of day with him. Shivers. Like a raw wind that gets to the bone. Pauses, her eyes falling on the cage. I should think she would have wanted a bird. But what do you suppose went with it? Mrs. Peters. I don't know, unless it got sick and died. She reaches over and swings the broken door. Swings it again. Both women watch it. Mrs. Hale. You weren't raised round here, were you? Mrs. Peters shakes her head. You didn't know her. Mrs. Peters. Not till they brought her in yesterday. Mrs. Hale. Come to think of it, she was kind of like a bird herself, real sweet and pretty, but kind of timid and fluttery. How she did change. Silence. Then, as if struck by a happy thought, and relieved to get back to everyday things. Tell you what, Mrs. Peters, why don't you take the quilt in with you? It might take up her mind. Mrs. Peters. Why, I think that's a real nice idea, Mrs. Hale. There couldn't possibly be any objection to it, could there? Now, just what would I take? I wonder if her patches are in here, and her things. They look in the sewing basket. Mrs. Hale. Here's some red. I expect this has got sewing things in it. Brings out a fancy box. What a pretty box. Looks like something somebody would give you. Maybe her scissors are in here. Opens box. Suddenly puts her hand to her nose. Why! Mrs. Peters bends nearer, then turns her face away. There's something wrapped up in this piece of silk. Mrs. Peters. Why, this isn't her scissors. Mrs. Hale, lifting the silk. Oh, Mrs. Peters, it's... Mrs. Peters bends closer. Mrs. Peters. It's the bird. Mrs. Hale, jumping up. But, Mrs. Peters, look at it. Its neck. Look at its neck. It's all other side, too. Mrs. Peters. Somebody wrung its neck. Their eyes meet. A look of growing comprehension. Of horror. Steps are heard outside. Mrs. Hale slips box under quilt pieces and sinks into her chair. Enter Sheriff and County Attorney. Mrs. Peters rises. County Attorney, as one turning from serious things to little pleasantries. Well, ladies, have you decided whether she was going to quilt it or not it? Mrs. Peters. We think she was going to not it. County Attorney. Well, that's interesting, I'm sure. Seeing the birdcage. Has the bird flown? Mrs. Hale, putting more quilt pieces over the box. We think the cat got it. County Attorney, preoccupied. Is there a cat? Mrs. Hale glances in a quick, covert way at Mrs. Peters. Mrs. Peters. Well, not now. They're superstitious, you know. They leave. County Attorney, to Sheriff Peters, continuing an interrupted conversation. No sign at all of anyone having come in from the outside. Their own rope. Now let's go up again and go over it piece by piece. They start upstairs. It would have to have been someone who knew just the... Mrs. Peters sits down. The two women sit there not looking at one another, but as if peering into something and at the same time holding back. When they talk now, it is in the manner of feeling their way over strange ground, as if afraid of what they are saying, but as if they cannot help saying it. Mrs. Hale. She liked the bird. She was going to bury it in that pretty box. Mrs. Peters in a whisper. When I was a girl, my kitten, there was a boy took a hatchet, and before my eyes, and before I could get there. Covers her face an instant. If they hadn't held me back, I would have. Catches herself, looks upstairs where steps are heard, falters weakly. Hurt him. Mrs. Hale, with a slow look around her. I wonder how it would seem never to have any children around. Pause. No, Wright wouldn't like the bird, a thing that sang. She used to sing. He killed that, too. Mrs. Peters, moving uneasily. We don't know who killed the bird. Mrs. Hale. I knew John Wright. Mrs. Peters. It was an awful thing that was done in this house that night, Mrs. Hale. Killing a man while he slept, slipping a rope around his neck that choked the life out of him. Mrs. Hale. His neck choked the life out of him. Her hand goes out and rests on the bird cage. Mrs. Peters, with rising voice. We don't know who killed him. We don't know. Mrs. Hale, her own feeling not interrupted. If there'd been years and years of nothing, then a bird to sing to you, it would be awful, still, after the bird was still. Mrs. Peters, something within her speaking. I know what stillness is. When we homesteaded in Dakota, and my first baby died, after he was 2 years old, and me with no other then. Mrs. Hale, moving. How soon do you suppose they'll be through, looking for the evidence? Mrs. Peters. I know what stillness is. Pulling herself back. The law has got to punish crime, Mrs. Hale. Mrs. Hale, not as if answering that. I wish you'd seen Minnie Foster when she wore a white dress with blue ribbons and stood up there in the choir and sang. A look around the room. Oh, I wish I'd come over here once in a while. That was a crime. That was a crime. Who's going to punish that? Mrs. Peters, looking upstairs. We mustn't take on. Mrs. Hale. I might have known she needed help. I know how things can be for women. I tell you, it's queer, Mrs. Peters. We live close together and we live far apart. We all go through the same things. It's all just a different kind of the same thing. Brushes her eyes, noticing the bottle of fruit, reaches out for it. If I was you, I wouldn't tell her fruit was gone. Tell her it ain't. Tell her it's all right. Take this in to prove it to her. She may never know whether it was broke or not. Mrs. Peters takes the bottle, looks about for something to wrap it in. Takes petticoat from the clothes brought from the other room. Very nervously begins winding this around the bottle. In a false voice. My, it's a good thing the men couldn't hear us. Wouldn't they just laugh, getting all stirred up over a little thing like a dead canary, as if that could have anything to do with, wouldn't they laugh? The men are heard coming downstairs. Mrs. Hale, under her breath. Maybe they would. Maybe they wouldn't. County Attorney. No, Peters, it's all perfectly clear except a reason for doing it. But you know juries when it comes to women. If there was some definite thing, something to show, something to make a story about, a thing that would connect up with this strange way of doing it. The women's eyes meet for an instant. Enter Hale from outer door. Hale. Well, I've got the team around. Pretty cold out there. County Attorney. I'm going to stay here a while by myself. To the Sheriff. You can send Frank out for me, can't you? I want to go over everything. I'm not satisfied that we can't do better. Sheriff. Do you want to see what Mrs. Peters is going to take in? The lawyer goes to the table, picks up the apron, laughs. County Attorney. Oh, I guess they're not very dangerous things the ladies have picked out. Moves a few things about, disturbing the quilt pieces which cover the box. Steps back. No, Mrs. Peters doesn't need supervising. For that matter, a sheriff's wife is married to the law. Ever think of it that way, Mrs. Peters? Mrs. Peters. Not just that way. Sheriff, chuckling. Married to the law. Moves toward the other room. I just want you to come in here a minute, George. We ought to take a look at these windows. County Attorney, scoffingly. Oh, windows. Sheriff. We'll be right out, Mr. Hale. Hale goes outside.